Welcome to the 3-0 show, part of the Athletic Baseball Show. It is Thursday, June 8th. Derek Van Riper here with Eno Saris. Richard Rowley off this week. On this episode, we will discuss the season-ending injury for Jacob deGrom. We'll talk about his future and what this means for the Rangers, an organization that's off to a fantastic start, the best start in franchise history here in 2023, and a team that certainly has playoff aspirations, and I think with its fast start probably has World Series aspirations as well. We're going to dig into an A1 story that Eno had published on The Athletic on Thursday as well. Where are the strikeouts coming from? It's a great mystery. Eno dug into it, so we'll get into that and a few other topics along the way as well. But Eno, we begin today with Jacob deGrom. Elbow surgery, of course, is on tap. It will likely be his second Tommy John surgery. There is a possibility of an internal brace, but they'll know once the surgery is actually performed if it's the ligament replacement or possibly both. As we have learned, that's a thing that happens now too, to help stabilize things once a pitcher works his way back from this injury. This is a Rangers team that went 6-0 and deGrom 6 starts this season. He's the best pitcher in baseball when healthy. I don't think that's a controversial take whatsoever. And he's had a Tommy John before, way back after the 2010 season. So given his age and everything we know about Jacob deGrom, what's the outlook for him long term as he tries to get back from what is likely a second career Tommy John?
It's a difficult one. There's not that many players out there who've had two Tommy John surgeries. Jose Rio might have had 4. we actually don't have great data on or descriptions of the surgeries he's had, so he's on that list. Johnny Venters had 3. It did not work out for him the third time. But the list of 2 is also an up and down list. Includes Hong-Shin Kuo and Hyunjin Ryu, who we don't know how that second one has affected him yet, because he's coming back from it. And also relievers like Todd Coffey et al. And the prognosis is always worse for your second Tommy John surgery. But he's a little bit on a very short list when it comes to the fact that it was 13 years between his Tommy John surgeries. It's not a revision or a busted new ligament. I mean, it is technically, but it's 13 years in, so it's taken a while to get here. And he's also on the older side. So, these two things make it risky. But, one of the things that I think is really interesting is, will he pitch the same when he comes back, in terms of, there's 2 things he did that really put a lot of stress on his arm. And we've looked at, or maybe 3 things actually, but we've looked at, direct stress on the ligament. We can do this now. We have these sleeves we can put pitchers in. We can ask them to throw, and we can measure the stress on the elbow in Newton meters and tell you what puts the most stress on your elbow. Number 1, velo. So he went from 95.6 to 99, sitting 99 in his late 20s to his early 30s. So that's stressor on the elbow. And a secondary aspect of that is sitting closer to your personal max. So everyone's 96 is not the same. If I'm throwing 96 and my max is 98, that's different if someone else is throwing 96 and their max is 100. So he was throwing very close to his maximum. And the third thing is, sliders actually put less stress on your elbow than high velocity fastballs, except if you account for velocity per mile per hour. Sliders put more stress on your elbow. So what happens when you throw a 93, 94 mile an hour slider like Jacob deGrom? That actually might be one of the more stressful pitches in baseball on the elbow. So will he throw his fastball 93, 94? Will he throw 99 when he comes back? Will he take a different approach? Chris Sale, Aaron Nola, these are pitchers that have in the past said, I'm not going to throw as hard on purpose, and I'm going to leave some in the tank for health reasons or for pitch clock reasons or whatever. Both times, both pitchers stopped doing it. You know why?
Because it didn't work as well as they thought it would work.
As good.
I mean, it's a great idea in theory. Well, this will preserve my career. I'll stay healthier. I'll get another contract. All of those things are good. We want pitchers to stay healthy and get paid. And if you're not as effective, then you're not going to make the money that you would make if you stayed healthy and pitched the way you were pitching before. So that is the chicken and egg problem that pitchers are still dealing with. With DeGrom, I used to think that he was a younger pitcher by usage than his actual age because he was a two-way player back in college and wasn't pitching full-time early in that part of his career. So relative to the typical player at every age, I'm like, maybe this guy is going to pitch until he's 40, 41, 42 if he doesn't have major arm trouble. It's possible we could see him pitching again at some point in 2024. I think more likely, sitting here today, the expectation is opening day 2025 as a target. Again, once the surgery happens and the extent of the surgery is known, more details will be clear.
Yeah,
and of course, the rehab is going to be the other tell.
The normal thing has been to sort of push it into the 13th and 14th month. So, that would have him coming back in, late August, early September next year. But if they're in this position as they are now, late next year, they may want to have him back, even if it is 3 innings at a time or whatever it is, because they may be headed towards the playoffs.
Yeah, Walker Buehler coming back from his second Tommy John this season, right? And early reports are encouraging, but we're talking about a guy who's doing that at age 28. Buehler turns 29 this summer. Jacob deGrom turns 35 here in 11 days. So a lot to be determined. Now, this Rangers team is sitting with 90.8 projected wins for the season. That is tied with the Astros. If you look at the Fangraphs World Series odds, they're just above 5%, which is probably the highest they've been in 8-9 years for the Rangers. This is a team that did a lot to get better as it kind of concluded its rebuild. And when you start to drill into why are the Rangers good, my first thought was, the young talent they'd been acquiring via trade and drafting and developing for these last few years during this rebuild. Most of that talent got to the big leagues, and then they supplemented that with some big free agent signings going back to last offseason when they added Marcus Semien and Corey Seager. And of course, they added even more this offseason. But the young core that they have on the roster is much smaller than you'd think. I was looking as of this morning, only 6 out of 26 players on their active roster were drafted or signed as international free agents by the Rangers. Josh Young, their 8th overall pick back in 2019. There's your big prospect from the group. Leody Taveras was an international free agent signing back in 2015. Jose Leclerc, way back in 2010. He's been around. He's a reliever. Cole Reagans, 30th overall pick in 2016, bullpen. John King, 10th rounder in 2017, bullpen. And Martin Perez, who left and eventually came back as a free agent. We're going to count him just because it seems like it's more appropriate to do that. But I mean, this is a team that was bad for a 5-year stretch from 2018 to 2022. They won 275 games during that time. The Orioles, who ripped it down to the studs, won 261. So the Rangers were pretty bad prior to this return back to a very competitive level. So I guess my question for you is, as you try to evaluate this team without DeGrom, and again, they've spent a ton of money in free agency. They've spent that money very well. They've been sharp in trades. Do you think they are still clearly an all-in, keep going for it now sort of team? Because they are older than you'd expect them to be for a team coming off of basically a 5-year rebuild.
Oh, 100%. This is a team to built to win now. And I am of two minds here. I would also like to throw Ezekiel Duran on that list just because he's been useful for them. He's come up, he's played, he's been better than I thought he'd be, and he's been a part of this. And I'd say this is a Two-Face. Who's that? The guy Two-Face?
From Batman?
Yeah, there's a bit of a
Batman
Two-Face thing
universe.
here. I think on the positional side, it's going really well. Actually, identify like Adolis Garcia is not my type of player in terms of the way this plate discipline leaves me cold. He chases a lot, but they've gotten a lot out of him, and I think they found a way that he's a real important cog to this. And I think that's, even though he didn't come up all the way through their system, he was acquired sort of halfway through his development process. I think it's a bit of a development win for them that he's done so well in given this situation. I would say that Duran and Jung are development wins for them in terms of these are players that can play in the major leagues at like a league average type or better. And Jung might be a real star. I think these are all. I think those are development wins, and I think they paired that with those signings in a really smart way, where they made the signings maybe a year before everyone understood why, because they knew these guys were coming up, and so these guys are coming up, and they're supplementing when someone's hurt. When Corey Seager's hurt, Ezekiel Duran comes up, and he's pretty good. And that keeps them alive as opposed to just going in the tank when one of their guys is hurt, you know? So on the position player side, I see a lot of things they do well. And they've developed some guys. They've bought some young guys and plugged them in. It looks pretty good. On the pitching side, I'm a little bit worried because they have gone with a little bit of the mercenary approach there too, where they've brought in the top end, not quite mid level free agents. It's not Seager and Simeon, but it's Eovaldi and Gray and Perez. Like they brought these guys in free agency, and that's fine. I don't know if Eovaldi's an ace, and I think a lot of times that ace with a capital A is like a young guy that's coming up and just you can't hit him. You know what I mean? Like the league hasn't seen him a ton. He's still throwing 98. You know, like I don't know. I think of when was it the Brewers guy Woodruff came up. You know, and Burns when he came up. That's like an ace with a capital A. And sometimes I feel like that really comes from within. And they have had some high picks within. They have tried to acquire young pitchers in trades. I don't see as much success on the pitching side, you know. And another way of saying that is you look at that bullpen, they should be producing. If you have a really good player development system, you produce relievers. They might have an okay one. I mean, a guy like I forget his. I'm looking at his name. It's Garrett Anderson. It's not. It's Grant Anderson. They have a guy like Grant Anderson come up, and he's pretty good actually. And if you have good player development, you create these guys. The Rays are built on this idea that they can create Grant Andersons over and over again. You know, and that's true for them. The Rangers have one Grant Anderson and maybe one Josh Spores. So we're seeing the pitching development change a little bit, and maybe it's getting better, but I'm still waiting for like an internal starting pitcher win. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's really surprising too, when you look at what they've done, they've had that success even before the last couple of off seasons in the second tier of starting pitcher free agency. That's where Nathan Eovaldi came from. That's where John Gray came from years ago. It was Lance Lynn, Mike Minor. I mean, it goes back before they were good. They were shopping in that bin and doing really well. And a lot of this goes to a bigger conversation where if we were going to say, how do we measure a front office's overall ability to succeed, or like their secret sauce? Like how do we decide? How do we grade decision making in baseball? What are we looking at? I mean, you look at how well a team drafts, how well a team does in international free agency, how well you do in big league free agency, how well you trade is really important. It's hard to grade, but it's important. How well you dig into the waiver wire and find players that get cast off other teams that you can either pick up and then develop, or even just pick up and plug right into a spot and actually end up with some surplus value that way. And then, of course, there's player development in all of this. And then even player development just alone is such a huge area. Right? How much credit does the front office get for the actual work being done by coaches at various levels? Well, they put the coaches in place. So you wouldn't give the front office a ton of credit for that. You'd give the coaches the credit for that. But it's always the GM or the president of baseball operations who ultimately gets the blame when it goes wrong and the credit when it goes right. That's just part of the gig.
But you're also creating an organization that has communication pathways, and so you were the guy who hired, or the person who hired the analysts, and you're the person who facilitates the discussion between the analysts and the coaches, and so therefore you hired the coaches, you hired the analysts, and it's the information goes from the analysts to the coaches to the players. So you're responsible for putting these processes in place. So and in fact, like, you know, where does the definition of front office even end, right? Does it include the analysts? If it does, then you get a lot of credit for that. Does it include coaches? That's usually coaching staff, quote unquote. But really, you know, I almost think of front office as a much larger umbrella, which includes, you know, any player, you know, in the organization is effectively part of the front office, because they're part of the process of anybody who's like has anything to do with play on the field in some way, but is not a player. That would be front office to me. But, I think it's really difficult because all those things you just listed, you could figure out sort of ways to do it. Like, so you could say, how well do you draft? Like when I worked with Mark Carrig on a piece about Brian Cashman, who I think is a good general manager. I think he's a very good general manager, but if you judge him by like world championships, then, does he come short? And dollars per win, maybe he comes short because they spend a lot. But, when we looked at who in the major leagues, what organization were they drafted by? All the players in the major leagues, who were they drafted by? Who were they signed by? And what we found was the top three teams were the Yankees, the Cardinals, and the Rangers. And that's cool, but like, how far back do you give credit? I mean, AJ Preller is now the Padres general manager. He was a big part of why the Rangers did so well in drafts and did so well in signings, right? So, if you just look at every player in the big leagues now, you're looking at 33-year-olds and 35-year-olds, and you're giving credit to front offices that drafted them 10 years ago. So the devil's in the details a little bit. If you really want to nail this, I almost feel like you have to do a 5-year window. And that's going to cut off some people where you drafted them 6 years ago, or you drafted them 2 years ago and they're not in the big leagues yet. Like it's really hard to judge anything. But if you go past 5 years, then you're giving other people credit. You're giving the wrong groups credit. But I think you could do something where you look at, anybody who's been in the big leagues less than 5 years or less, who drafted them? Okay. Look at those rankings and say, okay, the Braves seem like they're really good at scouting, right? I would just assume that, whatever scouting grade we've put down there, the Braves are near the top. What other teams do you think scout really well?
The Dodgers.
The Cardinals seem pretty good at just creating major leaguers, right?
They have been for a long time. They've given away a lot of major leaguers. I mean, Adolis Garcia was in their system. It was cash considerations that brought him to Texas. And
Randy Arozarena.
Important player. Yeah, Randy Arozarena for the Rays was kind of just one of the pieces of a trade. He wasn't the focal point of that trade.
And we were looking at the Rays and their recent drafts, and they picked late in the first round, but there's been a lot of misses. And what was it? You found basically Josh Lowe and
Shane McClanahan. I mean, for the first round hits, you can hit in later rounds too. I mean, Cleveland does that really well. Mm-hmm. Cleveland gets guys like Shane Bieber and Tanner Bybee and turns them into very good big league starters or excellent big league starters. And if you draft those guys 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round, it's even more valuable to find them later, right? I mean, again, we're looking at production for dollars, which feels gross, and I don't like doing it that way.
But now you're also looking at production per slot, which is actually maybe player development.
Right.
Because your scouts, this is why it's so intertwined. Your scouts, I said, Shane Bieber is better than this draft slot. Let's draft him. So they get a little bit of credit. But then your development staff got Shane Bieber from 89 miles an hour, to 94, and refined that breaking ball and made him, part was the player did the work, of course, but that part's always gonna be chaos in whatever system we're trying to put together. But then the coaching staff gets a lot of credit for Shane Bieber. You could do something like incoming draft grades. Most places will at least have a future value grade on a player, be like that. The scouting grade is 20 to 80. They'll say this is a 45 player, right? And you could take those draft day grades from Baseball America and then say who outperformed those draft day grades and who underperformed those, and just basically attach a player to his draft day grades and find a way of comparing those and then giving players credit. I would assume, who do you think are really good player development? I mean, again, the Dodgers. This is why the Dodgers win all these games. We gave them scouting, they're in the top, and we're going to give them player development. But I think the Rays are good. The Astros
are great at it. Yeah, took
$5,000 pitchers. That's another way of looking at it. It's like you spent $5,000 on Luis Garcia and you got a major league pitcher out of it. So I think the Astros are great at it. I think the Yankees are decent. I think the Mariners pitching development looks like a strength. So those are teams that come to mind. The Brewers, are a wild card for me. Maybe on the pitching side, but on the hitting side, who's a real win for the Brewers internally? I'm not sure. So not
Was
so sure.
Brandon Woodruff supposed to be this good? He was an
No,
11th round pick out of college.
they added 4 or 5 ticks to his
Right.
velo.
That's a huge success story. Corbin Burns, I think, had
He
more
was always
pedigree.
outstanding spin rates, and
He was a 4th rounder, though. Like,
yeah.
that's not a surefire going to be a good big league starter. I mean, to turn him into what they've been able to do. And again, players deserve credit in this too. This is not just a team
it's
turning
chaos.
a player into this.
It's chaos. Like when we vote for manager of the year, almost always we're voting for which players overperformed.
Right. And the manager didn't build the team.
Yeah.
So there's that.
So we're gonna misplace credit in this work, but I would definitely think that in terms of player development, the Brewers belong in that conversation. I wonder, the Braves are very interesting to me because I don't know why, but I just tend to think of those as scouting wins. But Ozzie Albies, Acuna was a top signing, but like Michael Harris, like they definitely have something that's going well in player development as well.
Absolutely. I think a lot of this just, to me, puts the focus back on how important scouting is. Like, even if you have a very sharp group of people in your analytics department, you need eyes on players. You need the ability to merge these two worlds together effectively. And I think the organizations that do that, the organizations that are not running thin on scouting, are still doing really well in these other facets and finding different ways to dig up players that can exceed expectations. I think that's where a lot of these success stories kind of begin. Somebody saw someone with the potential on a field somewhere and said, hey, maybe if we take this player here and do these things, we can actually turn this player into an everyday player or a possible star. I mean, international free agency deserves its own series of episodes. We're not even going to go down that rabbit hole. Like, that is...
Oh, and it's so like morally bereft and disgusting. And there's a lot of issues there. Like how many of these current Braves were signed by John Capalella, who was like banned from baseball for his practices.
Right. And even thinking about the credit game too. I mean, Chris Young was the GM for the Rangers starting in December of 2020. John Daniels had been previously promoted to president of baseball operations. He was just let go last summer. How much of what the Rangers have done as an organization should still be credited to John Daniels? I mean, some of the time they were working together. It's one of those things.
That's why I would try to stay away from like the myth of the CEO, where like, yes, the CEO is important. I did say earlier they're setting up all these processes, but if we're doing this, it's more of a front office ranking than it is like a GM ranking, because it makes it even worse. Like it makes it even worse to try and like, yeah, how valuable is Chris Young? Like, oh, I don't know is the answer. But also like teams that are in flux are just super interesting to me. Like the Orioles, they had a lot of high picks, right? So when you look at the Orioles as they're presently constructed, you're looking at some of the accrual of high picks, like Adley Rutschman, is, how much juice do you give the front office of the Orioles for picking Adley Rutschman when like he just seemed like a consensus 1-1 pick? Nobody had a bad word to say about him. And then he made it through, and he did everything he was supposed to, and he's been great. I mean, you have to give them a little bit of credit for scouting and a little bit of credit for player development, but that one just seems like, hey, you got the 1-1 pick, and 1-1 picks like more often than not work out.
I mean, I'll put it on a scale to say if you give the Nationals any credit at all for taking Bryce Harper 1-1 back in the day, I mean, like what? One tick more credit goes to the Orioles for taking Rutschman. That's about it. That was a no-brainer sort of pick. I think I kind of look at what they do in the college football world and think maybe that's closer to the right way, where you can look at where a player was entering the league. So in that process, coming out of high school, you're a 3-star, 4-star, 5-star recruit if you're a player that colleges are excited about, right? How many of those players get through and make it to the NFL from each program? And if you take a 3-star player as a college and you turn that player into an NFL player, that says a lot about your coaching and that player's work ethic and all those things. That's
player development to me, is taking a 45 and making him a 50. You know?
Right. So you have to have consensus scouting grades going in, and then look at results coming out.
Yeah, because otherwise we might just be testing Baseball America. If we just throw Baseball America in there, like might just be testing their system as opposed to actually getting at what we're trying to get at.
Yeah, so you would just need a lot of well-informed opinions and evaluations mashed together at the beginning just to have a good sense of where everybody was truly starting, and then look at the final results and say, okay, this team did the best job taking players that were projected to be 35s and 40s and actually turn them into big leaguers or regulars or above average regulars, whatever your various cutoffs are. So
I think in Baltimore, you're seeing, like, I don't want to give them short shrift and just be like, well, I got high picks, because you're seeing some wins, waiver wire wins. Jorge Mateo, I think that was a waiver acquisition. If not, it was a small trade, and then Tyler Wells did not cost them much to acquire, and he's a major league starting pitcher. Kyle Bradish was a 4th rounder that has gone up and down but has figured it out. So they Cedric Mullins was a 13th rounder, but that was 2015, so that's previous organization or whatever. But the new organization may have been part of, like, hey, stop switch hitting.
Right. I mean, same could be said maybe for Austin Hayes, right? A 3rd rounder in 2016 who's
now having his best
barreling
season.
The ball more than ever. So no, there are a lot of things the Orioles have been doing very well. That I don't think either one of us were trying to imply that the success they are having now is the result of just being bad and picking early. They have found players from all different sources. I mean, Ramon Urias was another waiver claim, just like Jorge Mateo. He won a Gold Glove last year at a new position. Like, that's pretty darn good to find a player like that on waivers. And yes, there's a little bit of a benefit that comes from being bad. You have the luxury of just seeing what happens with interesting players, whereas teams that are trying to compete can't necessarily do that. But it's still important to get those players right. And yeah, Mullins is
the waiver wire piece might be the easiest, right? Because you have a very fixed price. I mean, I guess what's a little bit tough about waiver wire is, like, your position in the standings.
Mm-hmm. Part of the tanking, you get first crack at those players.
Easier to do the waiver wire game if you get first crack at them. But there are teams that sort of establish themselves as waiver wire hawks. The Dodgers, again, dang it. Evan Phillips for free off the waiver wire. I got DMs from analysts being like, damn it, I wanted Evan Phillips, and he's their closer now, so I think when I think of waiver wire kings, I think of the Giants. Mike Yastrzemski and I think Lamont Wade was a trade, but they seem to be always like I have an email that I get from the Giants with all their roster moves, and they're always acquiring somebody off waivers and DFAing somebody. It seems like every day I get one of those emails. So they are super active on that. And I wonder, the Pirates, they seem to be improving their pitching development processes. They're starting to have some hitters there, but they also last year just lost the most amount of players in the Rule 5 draft in the history of the Rule 5 draft. So, like, there's something going on there too, where that's the opposite side of the waivers thing, where you're like, maybe we need to have a better waiver strategy, or better. It's a way. Another way of looking at it is roster management. Who doesn't lose players to waivers is the Rays, because they just traded Xavier Edwards. The reason they traded Xavier Edwards, who they got in the Blake Snell trade, was not necessarily they think that Xavier Edwards is terrible. It's because Xavier Edwards has to be put on the 40-man next year. And they don't want to be, a day before having to put him on the 40-man and go, hey, does anybody want Xavier Edwards? And then everybody else in the league can be like, yeah, for nothing.
Right. It's a leverage
so a year before they trade him for something so that they don't look as desperate. That's what the Rays do. The Guardians hold the line on their guys like that, and then end up sometimes just releasing them. So there's just a bold, like a bigger thing here that's waiver and roster strategy. You can almost put it all together somehow and look at players lost in Rule 5 drafts, players lost on waivers, players gained on waivers. You could probably add up that fairly easy. I think this might be one of the easier parts of what we're talking about.
Well, what's interesting is Roster Resource actually has a tab that I was going to make myself. So I'm glad I don't have to do the work. You can sort by homegrown, free agent, trade, waivers, and Rule 5, where every team got each player on its current 26-man roster from. The Orioles actually have the most players from waivers on their roster. They have 5 players out of their 26 they got from waivers.
Where's this page?
It is a tab on the Roster Resource breakdown. It's the Breakdowns tab, yes.
Breakdowns. Look at this.
Yeah.
Homegrown, Houston, Cleveland, and interestingly, though, Royals third, which is, you might be like, oh, player development scouting, except they're not good.
They are struggling. And interesting, too, they only have 2 players in their roster via trade, which is the lowest total in the league. You have to have players people want to get a trade done. That's part of it. I mean, it's weird. It's weird to see that.
The top of the trade thing is so obvious. If you're listening right now, just think in your head of who you think has the most players on their roster via trade. And amazingly, the first name that might have popped into your head is 5th. Seattle is 5th with 12. Miami, I think they always seem open for business. They also have a sort of like a difference in pitching and hitting quality. So that seems like they're rife for trading. Oakland is 3rd. That's very obvious. Not only are they in the middle of a rebuild process, but they trade all the time. They're always trading.
Yep.
Tampa, 2nd, always trading, 15. Number 1, might surprise people, it's tied with Tampa, is Milwaukee. And that's why I have a hard time sometimes adjudicating and judging the Milwaukee front office, because I look at the hitters and I say, where's the player development process on the hitters? What's the overall process here? They're not really a free agency team. I think they more often than not win their trades, though. And that's something you can say about Milwaukee, I think.
How would you grade a trade? How far down to the roots would you go? I guess I'm thinking of a trade tree, right? Because trades go on forever. They really do. There are some trades you can trace back 20 or 30 years because of club control and how that works, which is pretty amazing.
Especially if you involve Oakland, because they'll trade one guy for 3 guys, and then 2 of those guys will work out, and then they'll trade those guys before they're so that tree just keeps on going and going.
I mean, I think you have to, if you were going to grade trades, the original source trade, the first part of the trade, the beginning, before you get all these branches, that would carry more weight than each branch. Like
maybe
each subsequent branch would be less valuable, even though it still matters.
Maybe you fix it to the biggest star, right? So that the trade is defined by who is the biggest star at the time of the trade. That's it. Done. Right? I think there's something there, but trades is maybe the most impossible part of what we're trying to describe of what you're doing. And also it changes over time. I've had very different opinions of the Luis Urias for Trent Grisham trade.
Right. Yes.
Over time. And I even forget the rest of it. It was
Eric Lauer went to the Brewers.
Lauer and
Zach Davies went to the
Zach
Padres.
Davies. Just an awesome trade that actually, when you sum it all up, doesn't mean that much or hasn't so far, right?
It's been a wash, I think, in terms of net value. As of today, I'd say it's pretty much even. With time for it to still kind of swing.
But seemed so exciting at times. Like, oh, yeah, the Brewers won this one because they got an infielder that can hit for power. He's a shortstop. What are you talking about, And then it was like, oh, well, the Padres won this. Trent Grisham is a plus defense, power, and speed outfielder. And then it was like, well, Trent Grisham forgot how to hit, so it must be the Brewers that won. So just, when do you, it's a little bit like the timing process on player development and scouting is when do you stop looking at that trade and decide a winner on it?
Yeah, it's complicated a lot by injuries and lost time, too. Urias has missed a bunch of time this year with an injury. He missed some time, I think, back in 2020, the year after the trade happened.
I loved the Pablo Lopez trade for the Twins. They get Pablo Lopez. They give up an infielder in Luis Ariz that hits for singles, but doesn't play defense well, doesn't run the bases well. Was even being moved off of second base to first base. He'd be the weirdest first baseman in the league. And I like that for trade. And I still like Pablo Lopez, but Ariz seems to be exactly what Miami needed in some ways. So. That one's a difficult. There's team fit too, right?
There is, yeah. I mean, I think in the case of, just to use the same trade you brought up before, if you're looking at the Davies, Lauer, Grisham, and Urias swap, some of that was creating a little bit of financial flexibility for other players in the roster who were going to hit arbitration, right? So getting rid of Davies and getting the club control from Lauer, that mattered.
Teoscar Hernandez for Eric Swanson. You say, well, obviously the Mariners won that trade, but then you look back and the Blue Jays actually did spend the money that they saved in that deal.
Right. So you kind of have to think about what else happened because of the trade? Who played in the other spots that were vacated? That's another way to consider it that I think makes it even more complicated, which, that's the moral of the story today. It's hard.
Super complicated.
It's hard to do these jobs. It's also hard to grade these jobs for all the reasons that we are
The easiest one might be free agency and, just because we have a structure there. But the thing is, it also is a structure that, frankly pisses people off. There's a lot of people who hate it, but dollars per war is basically you just look at dollars spent in free agency and you look at wins above replacement that they acquired in free agency. It is a way to measure how efficient teams are at spending in free agency. And it actually seems like the one thing that you are doing there is testing the model a little bit, right? Because the teams themselves have their own wins above replacement number, right? Mm-hmm. So they will have seen every of these transactions. You'll be testing Fangraphs WAR or Baseball Reference WAR to some extent, but at least there's a structure there that's pretty well established, and you can say, and in terms of getting great players on the cheap, are there teams that come to mind? I mean, I think Tampa, I think the Zach Eflin signing, that was the biggest signing of their career, and of Tampa's organizational history, and it seems to be doing pretty well. And it was not a big signing, for the Phillies or the Dodgers or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways to look at this too. I mean, you could consider the short-term deals. I always think the Dodgers being just good at finding the pitchers who want to spend a year figuring things out. It was Tyler Anderson a year ago. It was Andrew Heaney a year ago.
Giants have a little bit of that reputation too.
Giants have some of that too. I mean, JD Martinez is doing it right now. I think there'll be a lot more interest in JD Martinez this coming winter than there was this past winter.
And there is a little bit there with the coaching staff, right? Where you sign a guy for 1 year and $5 million and you have a great coaching staff. And that's why he outproduced. And that's why he made you look good in free agencies, because you knew you could rely on your coaching staff.
But the other part of this is it's been such a big part of the baseball conversation on the internet, in the history of the internet, is we know that, yes, relatively free agency, big free agent contracts especially, are not good values, right? 7, 8, 9, 10 years of players at $25 or $30 million a year. The end of the contract will not be a, air quotes, good value, because by age 37, 38, the player will not be the player that you signed back when they were 28, 29, 30. And we know a lot of players are already post-peak when they reach free agency. So I think you have to look at the willingness to give players big piles of money and kind of evaluate those deals almost in a different way than you do the 1 and 2 year deals, where you're trying to accomplish very different things there.
You're trying to get a star, and so you're willing to overpay because you're getting a star, and a team like Tampa is just never going to do that. So, if you do a dollars per war list, Tampa will be near the top. But does that mean that they nail free agency better than anybody? Maybe I think that's sort of what you're getting at. Yeah, so think about Marcus Semien as example. Probably one of the most underrated big free agent signings so far. We're in year 2 of a 7-year deal, and he was off to a slow start. Around this time last year, people were panicking about that contract around this time last year. Now it's like, oh, great, $25 million a year. Yeah, sign us up. We'll do that forever.
The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. It's probably going to be very good for a while, and then eventually he's going to be more of a league average sort of guy, and it's not going to cause any problems for them. It's going to be fine.
Right. So you're still going to have problems of cutoff, right? Because you're never going to be able to say, okay, all the contracts are over. Now we can look at everybody. You're still going to have problems of like some of these contracts are in the middle where they look better, and some of them are near the end when they look bad. Like,
if you sign players like this, 7-year, 8-year deals, and you go to the postseason, and you go to the postseason multiple times in the early part of the deal, and the player is actually undervalued, which happens on some of these long-term deals, those seem like great years in terms of outcome on two fronts. One, the player exceeded the salary, which, again, I feel gross breaking it down this way, but we're trying to quantify something that's hard to quantify. And then two, the actual success of the team has that sort of added business benefit. So I don't think the playoff success is necessarily part of the calculation very often either. Like, you spent money on players, but you also went to the postseason. That matters.
Like think about. I mean, if it worked in San Diego, then it would be great. If it doesn't work in San Diego, it'll look terrible by all of our metrics because they have $300 million guys and da 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 da. Mm-hmm. The another way I think of this is, when we were thinking about trades, like the Aroldis Chapman for Gleyber Torres trade, that changed baseball. You are not going to get a reliever. You're not going to get a middle infield prospect near the big leagues of that quality for your reliever anymore because of that trade. I'm pretty sure. I think that trade changed baseball. However, the Cubs won it all, and they hadn't in like 100 years.
Right. And if that's the difference, and the margins are small in winning titles and not winning titles, if that's the difference, are you upset that you gave up too much in a trade? Is the trade bad? I think it's really hard to evaluate it independent of the actual outcome on the field. But it's also hard to attribute with a lot of accuracy just how much of a difference that move made versus the alternative move or no move at all.
So we have to put the most basic number in our appraisal. Wins.
Yes, and playoff wins.
Yes, but only a sort of equal weighting to wins. I don't like as a separate category where they get a whole. I would almost throw them in with wins. Like maybe
it's an opportunity to recruit more.
Total wins,
counting the postseason.
That's how I'm comfortable doing it. And this is because, and this is where I differ from a lot of fans, possibly. I know that this happens every postseason. We have this discussion, but for me, a team that wins 95 games and wins their first round playoff series was a success.
I don't disagree with you, but I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, yes.
Because we have, I think, in a lot of aspects of fanhood, and we have evolved or probably digressed more into this state of championship or bust. We didn't win the title, failure, right?
Yeah.
It's every.
But that
every
means 29 teams are a failure every year. That's just depressing, man.
That's not even how a bell curve works.
I had a friend tell me it's not a dynasty unless you. It's not really worth it unless you win 3 and 10. And I'm like, so like, there's like 3 teams that have ever been good. Like ever?
I guess 3 dynasties or whatever by that definition, and that's fine. You can make up more subcategories of great teams until you're exhausted. I'm not going to be the one fighting back on that. I'm just here to try to understand what's happening on the field and learn. But
total wins gives you credit for going to the playoffs because you add more wins, but it doesn't give you like it gives you a little bit more credit, right? It's like if you think about it, it's like 95 wins. That's the big number. And then an extra 13. Well, that's cool.
Yeah. Well, the other example here, I mean, Lorenzo Cain, thinking about the recent Brewers, he had a 5-year deal, $80 million, $16 million a year, which for an age 32 to 36 center fielder, I think they knew at the time, okay, yeah, maybe years 4 and 5 aren't going to be as good as years 1, 2, and 3. Year 3 happened to be 2020, so there's nothing to glean from that. If you look at that, that's like the perfect deal of front-loaded great production. Back end, unfortunately, wasn't working out. But you sort of knew that going in, and it was part of this window that's been open for them for a few years where he filled a huge need on that roster.
In the short term, and that's what it took to get him. What was the trade? Because they got 9 wins out of it, or 8.5.
Well, that was just the signing. I'm just thinking
what
about
was
that.
The signing? Sorry, what was the signing?
That was Lorenzo Cain. It was 5 for 80.
What? And when did they sign it?
2018.
5 for 80. So they spent $10 million a win, $10 million per win, and in our thing, it would look like a slight failure, because at that time wins would be costing sort of 8 to 9 million.
They were
but
just
not
a
that
shade
bad.
below that. Yeah,
but not that bad.
Again, there's a lost season in there, a 2020 season that.
Another thing that would screw up all our metrics, probably.
That's what it does. So yeah, a ton there to dig into beyond this episode. But I wanted to get to your A1 from today. Where are the strikeouts coming from? And a ton of work went into this story, and I guess I want to give you the floor. Like, what's your after writing it?
This is what's interesting is that this is a culmination of things I've written about since 2015, and the most recent entry point was that if you look at players in bins of fly ball rates, you could see that the top fly ball rate bin has the best OPS. And so you could say, oh, hey, everybody should be hitting fly balls. So then I started talking to the guys who hit the most fly balls. And if you listen to Rates and Barrels, I have this particular nervousness that gets around me when a hitter hits half his balls in the air. A 50% fly ball, I start to be like, ooh, I don't know about this. Because the batting average gets really shaky. It gets down to like 190 sometimes. And their strikeout rate starts pushing the roof. And I feel like that guy can be pitched to. That guy's got an uppercut swing. And so I talked to all the guys who have 50% fly ball rates, and guess what? They do all have uppercut swings. It was Kyle Schwarber and Lamont Wade Jr. and Cody Bellinger. And so when I talk to those guys, though, they all talk about, I don't want to have this big of an uppercut. I need to hit the high fastball. In order to stay in this game, I need to find a strategy to hit the high fastball. And so they said it's more about hitting the ball hard and figuring out ways to hit every place in the zone. And so that's sort of when a light bulb went off for me, where I was like, well, there's a lot of people who blame the uppercut swing on, strikeouts, all these strikeouts in the game on the uppercut swing. But when I talk to the guys who do the most uppercutting, they don't want to do all this uppercutting. And when I look around the game with the more sophisticated statistics that we have, it doesn't actually look like there's a ton of uppercut swings around baseball. And so I went back to a piece that I was looking at in 2015, which is that power lives out in front of the plate. So if you graph the distance in front of the plate to behind the plate, and you look at where home runs live, more home runs are hit out in front of the plate than over the plate. And that has something to do with how the swing is shaped. If you think about a swing, or at least the modern way of thinking of a swing is that you want to be flat through the zone, so that if you hit in the zone, in the strike zone somewhere over the plate, you're going to hit a line drive. But if you catch the ball out front, it's that part of your swing that starts to finish. Everyone finishes a little bit higher, right? So when you're finished a little bit higher, you're straight through the zone, and then bing, you got that little and that's where home runs are, is where you're kind of flat, but then you catch it right in that bing, and it's a home run. And so I think the sort of modern philosophy of hitting is flat through the zone, and if you catch it out in front, then it's a homer. And if you catch it in the zone, it's a line drive. They do want to hit line drives. I promise. People are like, oh, batters are okay with striking out, and, they don't care. No, they care. They don't want to strike out. They don't want to strike out. They want to be flat through the zone and hit line drives, and they also want to maybe catch it out in front. And that's the big thing that's happening is if you catch it out in front, you hit the homer. If you want to catch the ball out in front, you have to start earlier. If you start earlier, and the velo goes up every year, that's the math. That's where the strikeout rate is coming from.
Yeah. Stuff just keeps getting better. So there's your other part of the moving target here.
Yeah. So, as velo goes up, and then as they're shaping breaking balls off of their velo, that's that, I'm trying to start out front I'm trying to get it out front, so I'm going to start a little earlier. It's coming in at 96 now instead of 95, and that's that sort of. It's a spatiotemporal relationship, but that 4D relationship between time and space and movement and velo and my swing, that's creating the strikeout problem. But if you want to blame one person in particular, it's probably the pitchers. It's the velo. And we just crossed, this is the first year, 94 miles an hour is 94.1 is the average fastball this year. And that's the first time since we've tracked it in 2002. When we started tracking in 2002, it was 89.
89. That was only 20 years ago.
And now 20 years later, we've crossed 94. And I've thought at times, I've looked at it and it's like flattened in places. I'm like, oh, that's it. That's all the arm can handle. We can only sit 93.5. And then it just keeps going up. So I wonder, like, you see guys hitting 102. Do you think we'd ever just sit 102 or sit 100 and throw 102 and just have starters that can, like, sit 100? I mean, we've seen Spencer Strider sit, 97 for innings. Hunter Green is sitting 98, 99 for 5 innings.
Yeah, and we're seeing, you see with starters sitting
just
higher.
Get more and more Hunter Greens.
You see more relievers pumping like 102s, 103s, and 104s in games. And you're like, what? Like Ben Joyce. Yeah. It's got some movement too. It's not straight as a string. It's not an easy, it's 102, but it's straight. Like, no, it's not. It's got a little bit of arm side movement to it.
Jordan Hicks throws a 102 mile an hour sinker with like 14 inches of horizontal movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think the thing is you're just going to have more and more of those types. And so the average fastball is going to go up. And then you look at the bottom part of the velo, like a lot of those guys are veterans on their way out. Your Zach Greinke types who are, they're shaping it and they're doing the best they can to stay in the game. But, when Zach Greinke leaves, an 89 mile an hour fastball will leave the game, and 103 mile an hour fastball will enter the game.
That average for the league will tick up just a little bit as a result of that trade off.
But I don't know what to do about that. I mean, I don't like people talk sometimes about like, every ball over 100 is an automatic ball, and you're like,
really?
Something about that. Like, is there any other sport that says you can't run this fast? You can't jump this high? Like, what if basketball is like, nope, your head was above the rim?
It's like I played in a softball league where the fences were too close, and instead of changing the fences, which would have solved this problem, and maybe there wasn't enough space to push them back, it could have made them higher. I guess
the fences,
money, all those factors. The rule was you could hit 7 home runs in a game as a team, and then they became outs at that point. I was like, that's dumb. The fun thing I want to do, we can only hit 7 of those as a team, and it was too easy to hit home runs at the park. I am not saying.
So then everyone had to try and figure out how to hit singles. But the hardest thing in softball is to wait on a pitch. You have to be like, wait.
There were probably so many teams that tried to save homers for when there were more guys on base, and then they didn't use them all. It's like, just hit them. Unless you're really good, just hit the 7 and be happy you hit 7. That's the truth. I think the velocity question, though, it makes me think about other sports, right? You think about Olympic sports, just mile or high jump or 100-meter dash and all those things. Like the records keep getting broken and broken and broken and broken.
The people who are running the marathon are like the winners of like the very best marathoners. Their pace is like 4:10 or 4, they're running like 4-minute miles for 26 of them.
Right. They're running marathon paces that used to be the record for the mile a long time ago.
And all the record milers are now jumping into the marathon and just being like, I'll just do what I did for the mile for 26 times.
So I know eventually you can't get back. You literally can't do it faster at some point, but I don't think we're there with velo for pitchers. And the problem is, I don't think we're solving the how do we keep guys healthy while doing this. That's not fixed either. So I think velo is going to keep going up, and injuries are going to keep tracking along with them, barring some sort of unforeseen development. The thing we kind of joked about at the end of Rates and Barrels was, in this year where Major League Baseball has made a lot of adjustments to the rules, the pitch clock being the one that really does a lot for pitchers and their health and how they work. they wouldn't dare, move the mound back or do something like that in the near future, right? I mean, because the thing you wrote in the story is that would change movement on pitches. That could be just as problematic. You might have a league that throws
balls that have another
more
2 feet
breaking
to
balls.
move.
Yeah, filthier breaking balls means more breaking balls, which could mean even more strikeouts. So that might not be the solution that some people want to be either. And who knows if they would actually consider doing that anytime soon.
Yeah. And they're testing it, and they've tested it. And what's weird is they tested the pitch clock, and they tested all the way through, and it made it. They've tested, to baseball's credit. One thing I will say in their credit is they test these things. They have the independent leagues where they test things. They have the minor leagues where they test things. They test them and try to see what the outcomes will be. But it is interesting that they've been testing this, and we haven't heard more. Like, it's not like, oh, yeah, in single A, they move the mound back. As soon as you hear that, we're like, oh, in double A, they move the mound back, it's coming. Like, automatic balls and strikes has been moving steadily through the minor leagues. It's probably going to come up as a challenge system, but it's in the minor leagues in a lot of spots. And so that seems inevitable, automatic balls and strikes. And maybe there can be something there with automatic balls and strikes where you play with the zone to mess with strikeouts. But the problem with messing with the zone is there's always unintended consequences. It's not like you can just make the zone smaller and there'll be fewer strikeouts. There's no silver bullet with the zone. I don't believe it, because you have to kind of think through it. Just think about like the incentives if the zone is smaller, what pitchers are going to do. Will they come closer to the middle of the zone? Then why would hitters swing less?
Right.
And if the hitters are swinging just as much as before, are they necessarily always going to make more contact, or is it just going to be the same amount of strikeouts? Like another way of thinking it is this: we've had changes to the zone before, and we seem to always find an equilibrium of 8 to 9% walks. Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
It's been 8 to 9% walks over the history of baseball. How is that possible with all the different zones we've had?
For as much as strikeouts have changed, to see walks remain pretty consistent is strange.
It has something to do with just like how much tolerance we have for walks, like like how much tolerance pitchers have for walks, and like it seems to have that's the equilibrium that baseball has found is 8 to 9% walks. That's it. This year was up a little bit early on, but then it's a regular old year again.
Yeah. Well, check out the A1. It's up on The Athletic already, so be sure to read that. theathletic.com/baseball show gets you a subscription for $2 a month. If you don't already have a subscription, you can find Eno on Twitter at Eno Saris. You can find me at Derek Van Riper. We got some Ellie De La Cruz talk coming at you on Friday. We've also got a little deep dive into Alek Manoah and the Blue Jays coming as well. So that's going to do it for this episode of The Athletic Baseball Show. We're back with you on Friday.
Always got the green light here.